On March 20th, 2026, the United States Treasury Department issued a general license. It authorized the purchase, sale, and delivery of Iranian oil. The same Iranian oil that the United States has spent 3 weeks and more than $200 billion trying to cut off from the global economy. The same Iranian regime whose infrastructure American B-2 bombers and Israeli fighter jets have been systematically dismantling since February 28th. The same Iran whose navy is largely at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, whose supreme leader was killed in the opening hours of the war, and whose ports have been struck repeatedly to prevent exactly this kind of oil revenue from reaching Tehran. The United States lifted sanctions on Iranian oil while at war with Iran, and the Treasury Secretary called it narrowly tailored. We do not celebrate weapons at Navy Beacon. We calculate whether they work. And the calculation that produced this decision is the most revealing equation of the entire conflict, because it shows in precise economic terms exactly where American strategic planning failed before the first bomb fell. Here is the number that explains everything: 140 million barrels. That is the estimated volume of Iranian oil sitting in tankers at sea on March 20th when the sanction waiver was issued. At current wartime oil prices near $112 per barrel, that is approximately $15.7 billion of Iranian oil that the United States just unlocked for global sale. $15 billion flowing into Tehran, courtesy of the United States Treasury. In the middle of a war the United States started, an Israeli security researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies named Danny Citrinowicz said what the administration could not say publicly. He called it funding a war against itself. Subscribe to Navy Beacon, because what we are about to show you is not a story about a policy contradiction. It is a story about a strategic planning failure that was visible before the war began, and what the economics of oil tell you about the assumptions that were wrong. Let us start with the problem that nobody wanted to say out loud before February 28th. The United States is not an oil-dependent economy in the way it was in 1973, or even in 2008. Domestic production has changed the equation. American shale output means that a closure of the Strait of Hormuz does not strand American oil the way it strands Japanese, South Korean, or European oil. Trump said it explicitly. The United States is not reliant on Middle Eastern oil. That statement is accurate. It is also incomplete in a way that the pre-war planning either missed or chose to minimize. The global oil market does not care where American oil comes from. It prices on global supply and global demand. When 20% of the world's oil supply is suddenly stranded in the Persian Gulf, the price of Brent crude does not rise 20% in America and 0% in Japan. It rises everywhere, because oil is a globally traded commodity with a globally set price. Before the war began, Brent crude was trading at roughly $68 per barrel. By the time the Treasury issued the Iranian sanction waiver, it had exceeded $112. That is a 65% increase in less than a month. American gas prices at the pump followed. The national average was approaching $4 per gallon, the highest since 2022. In the Gulf states that import nearly all their fuel through Hormuz, prices had effectively doubled. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency with 40 to 45 days of petroleum supply remaining. European chemical and steel manufacturers imposed surcharges of up to 30% on their products to offset electricity costs. The OECD raised its global inflation forecast by 1.2 percentage points and downgraded its global growth projection. All of this was a foreseeable consequence of closing the Strait of Hormuz. The question the pre-war planning had to answer was not whether it would happen. It was how long it would last, and whether the war's objectives could be achieved before the economic damage exceeded the strategic gain. The answer the planning produced was apparently weeks, not months. That answer was wrong. Now let us look at what the administration actually tried before it got to lifting Iranian sanctions, because the sequence tells you how quickly the options ran out. Week 1. The administration released oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, 172 million barrels authorized over 120 days. That is the largest SPR release in American history, larger than the releases during Hurricane Katrina, larger than the releases during the 2011 Libya crisis, larger than the coordinated IEA release in 2022 during the early Ukraine war. The United States and its allies put 400 million barrels of reserve oil on the market, the biggest coordinated release on record. It was not enough. oil prices continued to rise. Because the physical supply problem is not a reserve problem. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a buffer. It does not replace the 15 million barrels per day of crude production currently stranded in the Persian Gulf. You cannot drain a reserve fast enough to compensate for a 20% reduction in global seaborne oil trade that has no end date. Week 2. The administration lifted sanctions on Russian oil already at sea. The same Russian oil that has been under American and European sanctions since 2022 for the invasion of Ukraine. A 3-year maximum pressure campaign against Russian energy exports, partially suspended, because the global oil market needed more barrels and Russia had barrels in tankers. Congressional Democrats described this as giving Vladimir Putin a financial windfall in the middle of his war in Ukraine. The calculation the administration made was that the alternative, oil at $120 a barrel heading toward $150, was worse than the political cost of the Russia waiver. Then week 3, Iranian oil. The Jones Act was also temporarily waived, a century-old law requiring oil shipped between American ports to travel on American-flagged vessels. Domestic oil production was accelerated. Trump floated suspending the federal gas tax. Every lever that existed was pulled, and oil prices kept rising. Type equation in the comments if you already understand why. Let us look at the Iranian oil waiver specifically, because the details of how it was structured reveal more about the bind than the headline does. The Treasury license authorized the purchase of Iranian oil that was already loaded onto tankers as of March 20th, not future production. Not oil that would be pumped after the waiver. Oil that was already at sea, already produced, already loaded, already bought in most cases by Chinese customers who chose not to unload it because Chinese strategic reserves were full and the marginal value of additional medium sour Iranian crude was low. The waiver was valid until April 19th. After that date, the sanctions reimpose and the remaining Iranian oil at sea becomes contraband again. Goldman Sachs estimated 105 million barrels of Iranian oil actually available on the water. The Treasury's figure of 140 million included cargoes in transit that were likely already booked. Iran's own oil ministry disputed the number entirely, saying Iran has no floating crude available for international markets. A statement that was diplomatically useful and commercially implausible. The practical effect of the waiver was this. It widened the pool of buyers for Iranian oil that was already at sea. Buyers who had avoided Iranian oil because of sanctions risk could now purchase it legally through April 19th. This was designed to move approximately 100 to 140 million barrels onto the market quickly, providing breathing room for Asian and European buyers who were running critically low. At $112 per barrel, the revenue flowing to Iran from that oil, through the Chinese intermediaries who had purchased most of it, represents somewhere between $11 and $15 billion. The Washington Post was direct in its assessment. The Treasury authorization of the sale of Iranian crude already at sea is likely to provide revenue for Iran's war effort against the United States. Not possibly, likely. The administration's argument was that this oil was already purchased by China before the war. Iran had already been paid for most of it under existing contracts. The waiver merely allowed the oil to be resold on the secondary market rather than sitting stranded in tankers. Therefore, the argument went, the marginal revenue to Tehran was minimal. That argument has merit in the narrow sense, but it misses the strategic picture. The global oil price at which Iran negotiates its future contracts, the political leverage Iran derives from being the country whose oil the United States needs to release. The signal sent to every oil market about the limits of American economic pressure. None of these are captured by the narrow accounting of whose name was on which contract. The senior fellow at the Center for Advanced Security Studies named Moritz Brake was precise about what the waiver revealed. It pointed, he said, in the direction of an underestimation of how well Iran would be able to resist the assault and the repercussions on the global economy. The risks were underestimated. Now let us build the full equation, because the Iranian oil waiver is not an isolated decision. It is the outcome of a planning assumption that was embedded in the war's design from the beginning. The assumption was that the economic damage from closing Hormuz would fall primarily on Iran. The sanctions that preceded the war, the maximum pressure campaign, the oil export restrictions, all of these were designed to minimize Iranian foreign exchange reserves before the conflict began, so that when Hormuz closed, Iran would bleed economically, while the United States and its allies could sustain the disruption long enough to achieve their military objectives. That logic has a structural flaw that every energy economist understood before the bombs fell. Iran does not need foreign exchange reserves to survive a closed Hormuz. Iran is on the inside of the bottle. The countries that need Hormuz open are on the outside. When Iran closes the strait, it reduces its own oil export revenue to near zero. But it also reduces the oil export revenue of every other Persian Gulf producer simultaneously. Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, all of them are stranded inside the Persian Gulf along with Iran. The economic pain of a closed Hormuz falls on every country that needs oil, not on the country that closes it. Iran knew this. Its military planning for a Hormuz closure scenario spans decades. The IRGC studied the 2002 Millennium Challenge war game the same way it studied every American doctrine document. It built a naval strategy around asymmetric disruption precisely because asymmetric disruption is the tool that converts a weak conventional military into an economic weapon of strategic significance. The maximum pressure campaign reduced Iran's oil revenue before the war. But oil revenue is not the only variable in Iran's warfighting calculus. The country that controls the valve does not need to sell oil through the valve to use the valve as leverage. And here is where the oil cliff enters the equation. By mid-April, according to market analysts at BCA Research who built the supply model, the temporary measures the United States has deployed, the SPR releases, the Russian oil waivers, the Iranian oil waivers, will have been exhausted. The oil cliff, as the analysts describe it, is the moment when the temporary supply supplements run out and the physical reality of a closed Hormuz hits global markets without any buffer. At that point, according to the model, the effective global oil loss from the war will double, from approximately 4 to 5 million barrels per day to something closer to 10 million. The world has never experienced a sustained supply shock at that scale. The 1973 oil embargo cut approximately 5 million barrels per day at its peak. This would be twice that on a global economy that has grown significantly since 1973. Brent crude at that point, without a resolution or a reopening, is projected by multiple commodity houses to exceed $150 per barrel. Some models go higher. The economic consequences at those prices, inflation, stagflation, recession, industrial shutdowns, are not projections drawn from theoretical models. They are documented outcomes from the 1973 to 1974 and 1979 to 1980 oil shocks, scaled to a larger and more interconnected global economy. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve release that bought the United States 3 weeks of price stability cost 172 million barrels. At the reserve's current drawdown rate, analysts estimate the United States will reach its lowest reserve level since the 1980s before the military objectives are achieved. You cannot refill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve during a war. The barrels that are released now are not available 6 months from now when the next shock arrives. The buffer that took 40 years to build is being consumed in weeks. Let us look at what China is doing with this equation, because the Chinese variable is the one that the administration's public statements have addressed least directly. China is the world's largest importer of Iranian oil. Before the war, Chinese independent refiners, the so-called teapots, were purchasing the overwhelming majority of Iranian crude that found its way onto the market despite American sanctions. When the war began and Hormuz closed, China found itself holding enormous quantities of Iranian oil in tankers at sea, purchased under contracts that predated the conflict. China did not rush to sell that oil. China waited. The reason is instructive. Chinese strategic reserves were full at the start of the war. Chinese refiners had significant inventory. There was no domestic pressure to rush that Iranian oil to market. And by holding it, by not releasing it, not helping Asian neighbors who were running out of fuel, not cooperating with the American push to bring more barrels online, China gained something more valuable than the oil. It gained leverage. When the United States issued the Iranian oil sanction waiver, China became the critical intermediary. Chinese refiners held the oil. The waiver allowed that oil to be resold. China could choose to move it quickly or slowly, to sell it to whom and at what pace suited Chinese strategic interests. Meanwhile, China announced restrictions on distillate exports, processed fuel products like gasoline and diesel that Asian neighbors urgently needed. Prices for these products in Thailand, the Philippines and Vietnam rose sharply. The Philippines declared its national energy emergency not because it lacked crude oil in the abstract, but because the refined products it needed were either stranded in the Gulf or sitting in Chinese storage that Beijing chose not to release. One security researcher described China's behavior as using energy as a regional bargaining tool, selling distillates to neighbors in exchange for political benefits. The United States asked China to help reopen Hormuz and send ships to escort tankers. China's energy secretary said he expected China to be a constructive partner. China has made no commitments. The equation China is running is straightforward. Every day, Hormuz stays closed and oil prices stay elevated. The economic pressure on the United States to find a resolution increases. Every day that resolution remains out of reach, China's relative position as an economy with access to Iranian oil, with full strategic reserves, with the ability to control distillate flows to American allies in Asia, strengthens. China is not shooting at American ships. It does not need to. It is managing the logistics of a war it did not start in a way that maximizes its own strategic position at minimal cost. Now let us complete the equation that the Treasury's general license actually revealed. The administration faced a binary choice by March 20th. The former national security and energy official Landon Derrance summarized it precisely. Find a way to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, or brace for a growing cascade of painful economic consequences. Nobody else, he said, had a bright idea. The Iranian oil waiver was not a bright idea. It was the absence of other options. The administration had exhausted its reserve releases. It had lifted Russian oil sanctions. It had waived the Jones Act. It had accelerated domestic production. None of it was sufficient to replace 20% of global seaborne oil trade. Because nothing can replace 20% of global seaborne oil trade on a 30-day timeline except opening the strait. And opening the strait requires either a military operation that the Pentagon has described as months away at minimum, or a diplomatic deal with the country whose oil the United States just sanctioned and then unsanctioned in the same month. There is a name for this position in strategic studies. It is called a culminating point. The moment in a military campaign where the attacking force has extended its reach to the limit of its logistics and political sustainability. Napoleon reached his culminating point in Russia. Germany reached it in the Soviet Union. The culminating point is not necessarily a military defeat. It is the moment where the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of stopping. The United States reached its economic culminating point, by most analyst assessments, sometime around March 20th. The military campaign has achieved significant tactical objectives. The Iranian Navy is largely destroyed. The IRGC command structure was severely disrupted. The nuclear facilities were damaged. The Karg Island oil infrastructure was struck. These are real accomplishments by any military measurement. But the war's stated economic objective, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, has not been achieved. And the economic tools available to sustain the campaign while that objective remains unachieved are running out. The sanctions on Iranian oil were lifted because the alternative was a self-inflicted economic crisis that would have arrived before the military solution. The oil industry executives who gathered at S&P Global's CERAWeek conference in Houston put the timeline plainly. The strait needs to be reopened by mid-April, or the economic damage escalates sharply. Kuwait State Oil Company CEO said it could take 3 to 4 months after the war ends just to return to full production. The wells that were shut in because there was nowhere to ship. The oil cannot be switched back on instantly. The world is not just waiting for Hormuz to reopen. It is waiting for the supply chain behind Hormuz to restart. Those are different timelines, and the gap between them is measured in oil prices, inflation rates, and midterm election results. The diplomatic track is now running in parallel with the military track in a way that was apparently not fully anticipated. Iran rejected the American 15-point ceasefire proposal. It counter-proposed 5 conditions of its own, including recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. The United States has paused strikes on Iranian power plants twice, first until March 26th, then until April 6th, citing ongoing diplomatic progress that Iran publicly denies is happening. The pause on energy infrastructure strikes, combined with the lifting of Iranian oil sanctions, has produced a situation that no pre-war planning document described as an intended outcome. The United States is temporarily funding its adversary's economy while negotiating with that adversary the terms of a ceasefire, while its military continues striking that adversary's military infrastructure, while that adversary's oil revenues at wartime prices represent potentially the largest single cash infusion to the Iranian state in years. We do not worship the machine at Navy Beacon. We worship the equation, and this equation has a number attached to it that the Treasury Department's general license did not publicize. At $112 per barrel, 140 million barrels of Iranian oil equals $15.7 billion. The entire pre-war maximum pressure campaign was designed to reduce Iranian foreign exchange revenues to the point where the regime could not sustain a prolonged military confrontation. The sanctions regime cost Iran hundreds of billions of dollars in oil revenues over the years it was in effect. In one general license, issued on March 20, 2026, the United States Treasury restored a significant fraction of that leverage. The question that will define how this war is studied is not whether the military campaign was executed competently. By most operational measures, it was. The question is what the planners assumed about the relationship between military success and economic sustainability, and whether those assumptions were tested against the scenario where Hormuz stayed closed for more than 30 days. The evidence currently available suggests the answer is that the scenario was modeled, the risk was understood, and the judgment was made that the military campaign would achieve its objectives before the economic consequences became unsustainable. That judgment was wrong by approximately 3 weeks and counting. The deadline is April 6th. The oil cliff is mid-April. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is at its lowest level in decades, and the Iranian oil that was supposed to be cut off from global markets is currently being sold, with American government authorization, to buyers who need it more than the United States needs the sanctions to hold. The equation does not lie. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. That is what happens when the economics of war run faster than the timeline of the plan.